My name is Caitlin Breedlove. I'm the campaign director for Standing on the Side of Love. Um, Happy to be with you today in transformational and incredibly difficult political times. Post this election, our position at Standing on the Side of Love is that we are in a very different political time, and it's going to take really different skills, really different kind of organizing to meet this moment. Figuring out all the components of that between now and the potential inauguration of Donald Trump. And then after that is going to be a great amount of work. However, in the short term, we know that there are many of you out there who have been looking for some de-escalation training because you are actually feeling a lack of the skills that you need and desire to make interventions on daily violence happening around your congregations, happening around schools, happening in your grocery stores, in Walmarts, and all the other places we're hearing about that Muslims, people of color, immigrants, and LGBTQ people are living through violence. So I wish that I could be with each and every one of you in person to do this. It's very hard to do even a minimal de-escalation training over a webinar, but we're going to do the best we can. Given that we think it's pressing and important to get something out there and meet the demand. You'll notice that accompanying this video, we have at least one and maybe two links we're going to send. One is specifically about bystanders and harassment guide. It's been going around social media quite a bit, but it engages how do you move from being a bystander to engaging someone directly that's being harassed, and it has some good tips. So because there's some of that covered in the link, we're actually going to talk about how do you engage and de-escalate people directly when they're hostile. So again, this is not comprehensive. It's really important to remember that de-escalation is something that happens in practice. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to use instincts and discipline to be better de-escalators. So a lot of de-escalation training that's happening around the country is in places like where I live here in Arizona or parts of the South and other red states where we have had to de-escalate armed protesters who have been attacking people while we've done actions, as well as just day-to-day interactions where a lot of working class folks of color have built community self-defense groups, as well as for undocumented people. So it's a little bit different than how historically sanctuary has been talked about, because that really focuses on places and sites. This focuses on interaction. So for this training, if you are willing and able, I recommend that you just have a pen and paper next to you. I'm going to ask you some questions, and you'll be able to jot them down to go back and think about answers. So the first thing I want everyone to think about is a moment in your life where you have escalated, or secondarily, where someone has escalated upon you. And by escalation, I would describe it as remembering that 75% of communication is nonverbal. So 3/4 of communication happen in our body, how we receive and how we give. So for example, when I'm escalated, whether it's that I'm angry at my partner, or I'm angry in an action, or I'm angry in a bar at something that someone says, I feel flushed. My body temperature goes up in addition to my heart racing. I feel like I'm not able to listen and hear. I'm able to hear but not listen. And I feel a sense of adrenaline, right? So thinking about a moment where maybe you felt some of those reactions, many people interpersonally, when they think about a not violent or dangerous moment, think about when somebody broke up with them, right? There's very few human beings. When someone breaks up with you, usually all your stuff is up, right? So that would be a classic example where you might not actually feel aggressive, but suddenly you go from 0 to 100, right? In terms of your physical response. Think also about moments where you've seen other people escalate and what you've observed as an outsider to that experience. Then I think I want to ask you to think about a moment where you've de-escalated yourself or where you've de-escalated someone else, right? So one of the things that I've learned is that I'm a more natural escalator than de-escalator. So we're going to think about that a little bit in terms of sometimes when I train this, I talk about my mom on my shoulder, right? And differences around class and race and gender and sexuality and immigration. My mom is a white immigrant who was a class ascender, grew up working class. And so when I'm in a conflict, her voice is always like, don't let them disrespect you, go get them. And for other folks, it's like their mom was like, be nice, right? Or grandma, guardian, father, grandfather, whoever was like telling you as a child about interacting. So understanding that escalation is going to look different and de-escalation is going to look different, right? Most of us are better at one of them than the other. Having had people de-escalate me, I can think about situations. Oh, I was at 10. That person talked to me. They did certain things physically. I came down. Or I was at 10. I gave myself a certain message. I did things physically. I made certain decisions. Often when I'm de-escalating myself, I'll excuse myself and like go to the bathroom or something, right? What are your experiences with that? And the reason I start with this is that we all have experiences in our daily life, interpersonally and with ourselves, in escalation and de-escalation. This is something that's not outside of our experience. So I think it's important to think about that. Okay. So when you are de-escalating generally, the first thing to know is every situation is different. And, a clinical social worker will tell you certain things about how you de-escalate someone having quote unquote mental health crisis, right? Direct action specialists will tell you something very specific about really heightened direct actions. But we can generally say that there are certain components that you want to think about. The first thing you want to do is notice. Think about, again, even if you're sitting watching this webinar, it's helpful if you do the motions with me so that you feel like you're doing the physical piece, because most of the communication's in your body. So think about how you move your eyes when you're noticing, and you don't want to be noticed when you walk into a room. You're not staring at everybody. You're not doing all that. You're sort of scanning, and often you have a soft, focused gaze, right? So one thing that we can all be doing right now, especially those of us who have white privilege, so we're not doing this every single day usually, and also those of us who pass as straight and not trans, we're not having to notice constantly what interaction is happening, right? That's very gendered, raced, etc. We need to be noticing, which means for me, also getting off our phones. One of the biggest problems I've seen in recent years with de-escalation is you can have people that are trained and they weren't noticing a situation when it was a 1 or a 2, and then it's a 10, and because they were on their phones. So one thing is thinking about when you're in public, how can you minimize your time on the phone so you can be watching people in your community, your neighbors and friends, or just people on a train with you, on a bus with you, on the street with you, to actually see what's going on. So some things you want to notice. It's really hard to make assumptions, generally being observant. Do you see any behavior that seems strange? For example, at protests, we talk about people going back and forth to cars a lot. Do you notice anyone physically, and it's important to not get overly judicious or scared, but do you notice certain things that would indicate concealed weapons? For example, when people have concealed weapons, there's also often a bulge in either armpit where a weapon could be held, and it's usually visible. There's a bulge around the waist of pants, which would be visible, or if people are wearing boots, more common, in certain parts of the country than others. One, in high boots, you'll see one part of the lower leg looks thicker than the other, right? You want to look for that if you're in situations. Again, I don't think you have to be scanning in your daily life every single minute, because that can create a strange culture as well, but being observant. Notice if someone seems agitated, if they seem escalated and nervous by themselves and you're not sure why. Sometimes people it'll show in their skin, they'll seem flushed, or they'll just seem nervous, sweaty, rapid eye actions of the eye are telling sometimes. But just notice who seems sort of like they're acting in a way that doesn't make sense with the situation. The next thing you want to do is assess. So that would be, if you think of 0 to 10 as a spectrum of escalation, you want to assess where a situation is. So a lot of people who, have spent time in bars or spaces where occasionally people get into fights. If you've ever seen somebody get into a fight in a bar, there's usually some steps before they're actually in a fight, right? You can hear people muttering to each other sometimes. You can hear people having heated words. You can see a rigidness in people's bodies as they're pulling away from the conflict. Or if someone seems really nervous or scared and you're not sure why, and not in an action way, right? Because if someone's going to do something, their energy is usually moving outward, but in a their contained way, right? So we've seen this a lot, recently when we're hearing these horrifying stories of young Latinx children and immigrant children and young Black children and young folks who have their head covered, they're moving in that space all the time, right? So looking at who's actually advancing on people physically or sitting too close to people is important, right? And then after you've noticed and assessed, then think about what the action is. So what would the action be? If you are de-escalating with total strangers in public, there's some common misnomers about what you want to do. So one thing that people often do of a variety of genders is do something like say, hey, 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 right? I do it. It comes naturally. I'm kind of a barker, right? That is not necessarily the best response when you're trying to de-escalate. If you want to bring everybody in a train car's attention to what's happening or to a street corner what's happening, that can be a way. If you want to actually de-escalate a situation, that wouldn't be my first choice, right? But your action, if you're going to be de-escalating someone, you are going to be approaching them. In protest, sometimes people are approaching you and then you have to deal with it differently. But for the sake of this moment, I think it's about approaching them. And when you approach people, there are certain physical indicators. Again, what's my main rule? 75% of communication is nonverbal, right? So if we are beings like other beings, we send the majority of our signals with our body, right? So when you're de-escalating someone, you want to, let me see if I can show you. You want to keep your shoulders down. Never approach them and begin a conversation like this, and never shrug, right? Do not cross your arms. In most communities, those are indicators like you're close to what someone's saying. And eye contact is different in different communities. In a lot of white communities, making continuous eye contact is a sign of respect. In some other communities, you don't, that's kind of aggressive. So you just want a soft gaze, make eye contact, don't not look at people, but, you don't have to be like this, right? Do not point, never point at people when you're de-escalating them, and never put your hands in fists, and never lock your frame, right? You want your hands to be like this. Sometimes like this can also de-escalate, right? As someone who's a woman identified person, I've often de-escalated. This often says a little bit more like I'm closed. It's not quite this, but it's like this. You want your hands like this. This is like, you're making me nervous. We don't need to go there, right? So I've done both of those before. And you just want your frame to be not locked. Don't slouch, but don't go rigid in your frame. Rigidity indicates a sense for many that like your muscles are about to tighten, right? You don't want to be in that place. Often now, when we come to actually what you would do verbally, it's really hard. De-escalation takes practice. People can say a variety of different things. And sometimes it goes right and sometimes it goes wrong. One thing that I think is always important is to remember the goal of what you're doing, right? So anytime I would be helping someone understand de-escalation in a demonstration, it's like the goal is not to be right. It's not to make your political point. It's not to take people on. It's to de-escalate the situation so the goal of the action can be met. The same is true when you're de-escalating an individual. The goal is not to prove that you're right. It's not to be a hero. It is to actually get them to cease and desist behavior. So most people, you can open a conversation by being like, what's going on? Like, tell me about what's going on. Like, tell me about what you're upset about, right? Sort of the opposite of what you would do if you're with if you're a bystander and you're actually engaging the person being harassed, which I think is an important tactic. It is important to say that ignoring the person who is harassing or attacking someone is at a lower level of escalation, right? That works if it's kind of, there's a lot of people around and it's in public, right? It doesn't tend to work if things are more escalated. Then you do have to engage someone directly, right? That's your best chance of de-escalating. So ways I would start is like actually listening to people, being like, what's going on? Hearing them out. You don't have to be agreeing with everything they're saying, but you can say things like, I hear that you're pissed. You can say things like, tell me more about like why you voted, like lead them down a total different conversation. Remembering that you're not going to be convincing them in the moment of anything. You're trying to take it down, right? You can say things like, I feel really frustrated about what's happening in this country too. That's an interesting one, right? Because you don't want to be full on agreeing with them, but if you're really afraid someone's going to get badly hurt, I would say it in a second. It's much more important to think about someone being badly hurt. We talked about a situation de-escalating the other day where we were playing out a scenario of someone, because we have open carry here in Arizona, so people are armed regularly and have been at Trump rallies throughout this whole mess that we're calling an election. Anyway, so I was talking about like a situation of someone saying, I'm against the TPP too. Like I'm confused. There's things I disagree with Clinton about, right? Like, again, political purism is like, no, I couldn't possibly. But if you're actually like, this person's going to be safer, because if someone wants to talk about politics or make a point about politics, engage them about politics, right? So those would be some things that I think are important. The other thing is like, you can start walking with someone and you can see if you can start walking them away. That's a little bit more advanced approach. Sometimes even there's times where when people are approaching, you can back them up. And often, cis men of a particular height can do that with each other in a particular way, right? It's actually a known in certain communities that like dudes are actually like, I'm going to be going forward and my buddy's going to be pushing me back, right? So I can still see macho, but I'm getting backed up. I wish I could show you this more, but you have two people. One is advancing and the other person is like, okay, buddy, it's all right. Come on now. It's okay. And this dude actually might be being okay to be de-escalated, but he just doesn't want to be visibly not stepping into the moment. So that's something to think about. I do think that while there are real safety concerns for us if we're de-escalating, in my experience, most of the time de-escalation works, and most of the time our risk is not nearly as high as the people who are being harassed or assaulted. So if any of this sounds scary or nerve-wracking, I'm thinking about worst case scenarios. The final thing I would say is that if someone pulls a firearm on you, this might seem like total common sense, but I've seen situations where people don't know what to do. The thing you want to do is you want to grab the person who's being attacked as firmly as you can without positioning in a way so that you're going to hit their head. And you want to just try to pull them to the ground. Like you just want to hit the ground. In any case that involves a weapon. And people know that because people are like, I watch movies, right? But it's actually much harder in real time to think about that for people who haven't been in situations like that. It can be, I've noticed, a very difficult situation, and you want to be incredibly calm in that case, which sounds hard, but like never yell at someone who has a weapon of any kind. Don't yell at them. Don't move quickly. And the main thing you want to try to do is just make sure you're as safe and other people around you are as safe as possible. And often people, because again, your 75% of communication is nonverbal, stuff kicks in, will follow. Like if they're watching a situation, they'll follow what you do, right? So if you move slowly, or you're stepping away slowly, because it doesn't make sense to lie down if someone pulls a knife on you, then you just you want to do this guy or this guy, probably this guy, and just back up, right? That's the best thing that you can do. Now, I just want to say that for those of us who haven't been in these kind of situations, the most common kind of de-escalation you'll probably be doing is unarmed people shouting and yelling, someone trying to make their point, right? That's the most likely thing. But I think it's really important, even in a like very brief webinar, to name certain kinds of risks, just in case people are in situations like that, given what's happening. And I also think that the more that we know these things and can practice them, the more equipped we are for this political moment. This political moment's actually asking something really different from us. And I think these are important things to know. Anyway, sending everybody a lot of love. Hope this was helpful. If you have more questions, you're welcome to get in touch with us. We may or may not have more answers. De-escalation is a difficult art. There is some interesting stuff online, just basic stuff, right, about de-escalating. But there's some basics for you right there. Take care, everybody.